topic in introductory algebra, and so that would be true obviously at the high school level, but also at the college level as well. And slope is a concept that's very multifaceted and often presented in many different ways. And so what's good about that is it gives students lots of entry points to start to understand the concept, but what can make that difficult is this fact that the multiple representations often lead to this disconnected and compartmentalized knowledge of slope. And so that obviously has some big implications for students' ability to continue in mathematics, whether that be trigonometry, calculus, statistics, whatever course comes thereafter. And so addressing this compartmentalized and disconnected knowledge has some important impacts on students' learning. And so maybe as a side motivation or background, I often teach the college algebra sequence. And so this is something that I see a lot, and so something that my motivation is always, how can I improve my instruction to start to address or maybe remediate some of that disconnectedness or some of those deficiencies along the way. All right, so the information I'd like to share with you this afternoon is going to focus on a few specific questions. And so first things first, I'm interested in what conceptualizations of slope do students bring with them into a college algebra course. So obviously if a student is sitting in a college algebra course, they've encountered information about slope before. And so I'm curious what they're bringing with them as they enter my specific course. And then also, I'm curious how students are thinking about slope as a ratio. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move forward. So my second question is, does or how does instruction impact students' existing conceptualizations of slope? That is, can we kind of work on this disconnectedness, or is it something bigger than instruction can handle? And lastly, how can instructors effectively respond to the observations about students' existing conceptualizations to hopefully move students' learning and understanding forward? All right, so the framework for this study actually merges two existing frameworks together. And the first portion of that framework is the conceptual slope network, created by Nagel and Moore-Russo. And so this specific network actually condensed a pre-existing network of how students conceptualize slope from 11 representations down to just the 5 that you see here. Okay, and so each of those is briefly defined, but given the context I previously alluded to, we're going to expect to see these top 3, the ratio, the behavior indicator, and the determining property, show up in today's conversation, whereas we're kind of going to set the trigonometric and the calculus conceptualizations to the side. Although there are always a student or two in our college algebra courses that have taken trig or have taken calculus in high school, for the purposes of this study, I didn't want to assume that that was the norm and they'd be carrying that knowledge into class with them. And so we're going to focus on just those top 3 conceptualizations. All right, so each one of these 5 conceptualizations can be further broken down into 2 representations. And so, kind of for the illustrative purposes, I'm going to talk about the ratio conceptualization. And so students can interact with that conceptualization in one of 2 ways. They can work with it analytically, which is something I'm going to refer to as the algebraic ratio, or they can refer to it or work with it visually, which is something I'm going to call the geometric ratio. And I suppose as just food for thought, the algebraic ratio is kind of this formulaic and procedural approach that you would expect to see a student kind of crunch the numbers and use the calculation when they're working with the idea of slope. And then that geometric ratio representation is going to be much more rise over run or movement oriented and kind of grounded in the visual.
Okay. Do you included that to sort of the counting?
Yes.
Okay.
Right. So the second piece of framework that I'm going to lean on is the APOS theory. And so some of you may be familiar with this, and so maybe quickly, this theory is represented by actions, processes, objects, and schema. And so maybe a brief description of each and then how they will show up or embed into this particular study. So an action-oriented understanding would be one in which students think of slope as steps, or maybe kind of memorize what to do when they encounter a slope question. And so they can enter into the question, but what tends to happen is their knowledge of slope is disconnected from their other mathematical knowledge. And so what is that going to look like in this specific study? Well, here we'd expect to see both ratio representations present but disconnected. So a student would somehow see an algebraic ratio problem, one where they're using that formula to calculate the change in y's divided by the change of x's, as different than a ratio problem that's represented geometrically. So the rise over run is somehow different than the change of y's divided by the change in the x's. All right, so processes. Processes would describe students using actions repeatedly, and eventually students are going to start to reflect on using those repeated actions. And the result there is going to be this developing connectedness between the idea of slope and students' other mathematical knowledge. And so in this particular study, what we would anticipate if a student was functioning at a process-oriented level would to be a connection between the algebraic ratio and the geometric ratio coming together. So students could flexibly interchange between those strategies or those representations, often within the same problem. All right, so last thing would be an object orientation. And so here we have a totally constructed set of processes. So lots of good connections between the different representations of slope. And so specifically here, what you're going to notice is in the bottom right-hand corner, we have that ratio conceptualization, and it's now connected to the other 4 slope conceptualizations. So students can now leverage what they know about the ratio conceptualization of slope, whether it be algebraically, geometrically, or both, to start to understand how slope embeds into a trigonometry representation or a calculus conceptualization. Questions, concerns? All right, so for the theoretical framework for this study, I did select teacher noticing, and teacher noticing addresses 3 different skills. And so I've kind of lumped these first 2 somewhat close to one another. And so attending is noticing the details in a student's work, strategies, arguments, or explanations. And then interpreting is how a teacher interprets a student's understanding based on just the evidence the student has submitted. So I can't assume anything or infer what's beyond their work. It's really just, here's what I can be sure the student knows based on the evidence that they have turned in. And so for my particular study, the interpreting piece is actually my coding of the students' explanations and their problems to reveal which ratio representations that they're using pre-instruction and then post-instruction. And is there any connection or movement within that APOS framework as instruction completes?
Is this instruction throughout the semester? Is that the pre-post, beginning and end semester?
All right, so the third skill here is responding. So all of this attending and interpreting is somewhat empty unless we take it reflectively to determine how we can make our instruction respond to what we've noticed or attended to in our students' work. And so for this study, what I'd like to be able to do is suggest some potential instructional decisions that might move students toward this more connected ratio representation. In other words, if students are operating in this action-oriented knowledge of slope, what we'd like to do is move them forward to try to move them toward a process-oriented understanding of slope, Why? Because eventually they're going to need that larger constructed sloped network. It has implications on their future coursework, especially if they're calculus bound in the long run. All right. So participants, I had 7 students who were in a college algebra course that I was teaching who agreed to participate in my research study. I should also fully disclose that this was a summer session of college algebra, and so it is a bit of a different population than we'd encounter during a traditional semester. So of that population, 3 of the students were high school students, and they all happened to be female. 2 were what we call traditional students, and 2 were non-traditional or returning adult students. And so I kind of had some nice subgroups fall out there just by virtue of the population in my class, which made for some interesting observations. It's also worth noting that I asked students to identify an intended major, and although this can change along the way, 3 students identified themselves as a business-housed major in some capacity. So either project and supply chain management, accounting, something of that sort. 3 students identified as a STEM major, so either engineering, pre-med, or plastics engineering. And then I did have 1 student for whom this was a terminal course. So he was pursuing an associate's degree, and this was the last math course he needed to earn that degree. And so I think the big aha here for me is that 6 of the students in this particular study did have much more math to take after they were finished with my course. And so I'm particularly interested to see how they're thinking about slope, because it has immediate implications on their next math class, their next math class, so on and so forth. All right, so instruments that I use to collect data. So pre-instruction, I asked students to complete 2 assignments for me. And one I called the student sample work assignment. And so this assignment included a typical slope question that I selected from an existing college algebra book. And then I provided a sample solution. I handed this to my students and I asked them to analyze the work that was provided. So in other words, if you were the teacher and you were grading this, did this student complete the problem correctly or not? And so if the answer was yes, the answer was yes, and if the answer was no, tell me what they might have done incorrectly or where they misstepped. I also asked students, if this were your problem, would you have solved it the same way as the sample work, or might you have taken a different approach? And if you were going to take a different approach, explain how you would have solved the problem. Each of these, again, I selected from an existing textbook, but they were all open-ended in terms of students could approach them using either one of those ratio representations. So we didn't lock them into a specific approach to solve the problem. So the second assignment I asked students to complete before instruction was responding to a series of slope statements. And these slope statements were developed in conjunction with another project that's being developed, but we selected 8 statements that corresponded with each of the slope conceptualizations. They're all open-ended enough that a student can choose how to enter into responding to these statements, but we asked them to respond to the given statement. So for example, slope is the rise of a line divided by the run of a line. Respond to that in words. And then also provide a sample problem that you think illustrates the given statement. So as I mentioned, both of these were completed before I ever started teaching about slope, because I really wanted to see what students were bringing with them as they entered the course. Post-instruction, I included a series of slope tasks on both the chapter test that I presented to students and then also on the final exam. So kind of a post-instruction and then a long-term post-instruction analysis of what their slope conceptualizations were. All right, so coding. So 2 coders actually went through all of the data and coded for a few things. So After each coder finished working with the data independently, we came together, we reconciled any discrepancies, and then moved forward with the analysis process. So in all of the pre and post assessment data, first we're looking to code slope conceptualizations. In other words, which of these 5 conceptualizations were students utilizing in response to each of the statements, the sample of students' work, or in solving their own slope problems in one of those testing settings. As I mentioned before, trigonometric and calculus conceptualizations didn't come up, but in a college algebra course, you wouldn't anticipate seeing those. The other piece that we coded for was which sub-representation was the student using. So if they were thinking about slope as a ratio, were they doing so algebraically and using the formula, or were they thinking about slope geometrically, drawing graphs, using the rise over run? So after all of the individual data was collected and coded, the other piece that we went back and coded was what we're calling a representational grounding. In other words, as you looked at the student's body of work pre-instruction as a whole, did they tend to have a dominant representation they used more often than not? So when they came against one of these ratio problems with slope, did they typically tend to lean on the algebraic ratio approach and result in, kind of utilize the formulaic approach with that representation? Or did they tend to draw a graph, count the rise and the run, and approach things geometrically? Lastly, we look for evidence of connectedness. So if a student was using algebraic ratio and geometric ratio, did they utilize them in isolation, meaning they were functioning at an action-oriented level? Or did they tend to start to connect those 2 representations and use them somewhat flexibly within the same problem? If so, we could say there was evidence of movement toward a process understanding of slope at a ratio level. Okay? So kind of this connectedness piece. All right, so what did we notice pre-instruction? All 7 students in the study had what we were calling an action-oriented ratio conceptualization. So each of the 7 students in the study definitely were able to demonstrate through each of the instruments they understood slope as an algebraic ratio, they understood slope as a geometric ratio, but they weren't able to leverage those 2 representations within the same problem. It was either one or the other in isolation.
Weren't able or didn't give evidence of being able to?
Didn't provide evidence of being able. Another noteworthy connection is that 3 of the 7 students provided evidence of good connections between the algebraic ratio and that behavior indicator conceptualization. So they were able to kind of take that formula to calculate a slope and then start to make some sort of connection to what the line was doing. Is it trending upwards? Is it increasing? Is it running uphill? And so this connection was present in the work of 3 students before instruction started. The other thing that was observed is that students were equally representationally grounded. So we didn't see one particular representation showing up more than the other. 3 students were definitely grounded in geometric ratio. So given this open-ended ratio slope task, they leaned on this geometric interpretation almost consistently across all of their work. Likewise, 2 students showed grounding in algebraic ratio. These 2 students actually never produced a graph of their own. They always went for a formulaic approach to find the slope. I'm sorry?
That's only 5. Oh.
Yes. Good call. So the last 2 students...
Kim's watching you really closely.
As you should. So the last 2 students didn't really have a strong representational identity. So what what we tended to see here is this grounding in what we call matching, for lack of a better way to describe it. The students tend to respond to the task the way the task is pitched to them. So if a graph is provided, the language in the written responses that they gave was largely movement oriented, rise and run, moving this way and that way on the graph and counting the steps between points. Whereas if a problem was presented algebraically, the student tended to say, oh, she kind of must be looking for an algebraic response, and completed the problem in the same format that it was provided. Which is kind of interesting that those two didn't have a strong...
Quick question?
Yeah.
Were the problems you created, I know one you had solutions, but were the problems themselves just strictly contextual problems, or just naked problems, or you know what I mean?
I do. So you're talking about the problems that had the sample work provided, or the statements?
The statement of the problem.
Statement of the problem. So,
I assume you had a statement of the problem and then you provided sample work, right?
correct.
Yeah, so
Correct.
the statement of the problem.
The statement of the problem was pretty neutral. It could have gone either way depending on the grounding that someone had. The sample work that was provided often did feature one representation over another. So then when we asked students, would you have solved the problem the same way? If they said yes, they were in essence agreeing with that representation.
But was there any context to the problem? Was it talking about business, or was there any contextual?
No. So typically these were very traditional sloped problems that you would encounter.
Like 2 points that apply to slope.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So trying to keep the real world kind of in the background, especially pre-instruction, so we can get a clear idea of what they were coming in with.
Okay.
Yes, sir.
These two students that were matching.
Yes.
Does that mean, were they, showing ability to do it as a geometric ratio and as an algebraic ratio, like in different?
Yeah.
Different problems?
So they could utilize both representations correctly in the context of the problem, but their work didn't show a strong preference to one representation over the other. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, like, sort of what the difference is, because it says we have up here isolated geometric and algebraic ratios interpreted. So they were able to, use one of the methods effectively, but within that problem, they didn't show evidence that they could combine the method?
Yes. So the isolation piece basically talks about within one problem. What the work showed is that it was either algebraic ratio the whole way through or geometric ratio the whole way through, but no evidence that a student was able to kind of jump between ideas interchangeably or flexibly. The grounding piece kind of discusses, did a student express a preference? So when they encountered a problem that they might not have seen before, what was their fallback plan to enter into that problem? And so for 3 of the students, they tended to enter it very visually. The go-to was, let me sketch it on a graph and see what's happening and do some movement. 2 of the students always resulted to using the subtraction of the y's over the subtraction of the x's. But these last 2 students just tended to kind of spit back the language model in the problem. So it wasn't convincing evidence that they had a go-to strategy. It was more kind of like, well, this is what's in the problem, so this is what I think you want, so I'm gonna try and make my words match what's given, and hopefully that's what you want. Any questions? All right, so overall, pre-instruction, this really suggests that college algebra students are carrying existing knowledge with them into the course, which we could argue is great. Maybe the downside of this is the ratio knowledge does tend to be very isolated. And so students did have a hard time connecting and using those 2 representations flexibly within a given problem. And so the good news is each exists, and perhaps the challenge is connecting those together. All right, so just a few other pre-instruction observations. As I mentioned when I was describing the participants, there were 3 kind of natural subgroups that fell out here. And so the traditional students did seem to provide the best evidence of moving toward a process-oriented conceptualization of the ratio slope representation. The adult students definitely struggled. Their responses, their explanations were far less rich than those of their traditional peers. We might expect that, right? It's been a little longer since the students have had to access that knowledge. But the good news here is my adult students did show evidence of both ratio representations coming in. The high school students definitely coded the most conceptualizations in their work. That is, they did tend to bring the ratio conceptualization, the behavior indicator, the determining property. They definitely had the most conceptualizations, but still showed this really disjointed algebraic versus visual or geometric approach. And they leaned heavily, exclusively, on an algebraic ratio representation. And again, we might expect that on some level. These are students who are coming out of algebra courses in high school, who are being taught information in the context that will be presented on the PSSA test, on the Keystone test, on any standardized tests we're asking them to take. And so there was a real focus on the algebra with this group.
And those were also all female.
They were also all female. Yeah, interesting, for sure. Okay, so just a few post-instruction findings. After instruction, 3 students provided evidence of moving from this disjointed, action-oriented interpretation of ratio toward a process-oriented understanding. In other words, they were able to now provide evidence that they were able to use both representations interchangeably within the same problem. What I was encouraged by is that transcended subgroups.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, so that was unanticipated, but a pleasant result. So what's interesting to note about these 3 students who showed movement in their framework is 2 things happened. They entered the course firmly grounded in either algebraic ratio or geometric ratio. In other words, they had a go-to strategy before we started teaching about slope. The other important kind of observation is that these 3 students had an existing connection between algebraic ratio and behavior indicator before I started teaching. The remaining 4 students didn't provide any evidence of movement toward connectedness or toward that process-oriented understanding. So they finished the course with their algebraic ratio and their geometric ratio still isolated. Didn't make me feel great about my teaching.
I was going to say, yeah.
A little bit of pride there, not gonna lie. In fact, 3 of these students finished the course in that matching representation category, and this was a little bit disheartening if I'm being honest. Only 2 students were in this category when the class started. And by the end, I had actually moved somebody from being grounded in algebraic ratio toward like, oh, let me just match what you're asking for. And so the students that were in this matching representation category when the class started and finished the course still in that category actually did provide evidence of having a very weak or disjointed knowledge of the ratio conceptualization. So that seemed to be the most troubling category.
So the other 2 started that way and ended that way. It wasn't,
Yeah.
there weren't any, anybody that started that way that went somewhere else.
No.
Okay.
No. So that says to me I have some work to do to address that for sure.
Or that they just know how to play school.
Potentially.
It sounds like they're-
Potentially,
once they learn how to
Were
play
your
school.
high school students like from the same high school? Or like from the same, no?
They're from the same school district, but they were each from different high schools
Okay,
in the district.
So it wouldn't be like they were in the same class before or anything like
No.
that? Okay.
No, they did not know each other prior to the
Okay.
course.
Hmm.
All right, we're doing a timekeepers. Like a minute
It's,
left?
it's quarter after.
Okay. So, what I have in the remaining slides, if you're interested, are some results about ways that we could potentially adapt instruction to address some of the observations from, or some of the results from this particular study. And so many of them really just involve this idea of leveraging a link between the algebraic and the geometric representation. So problems that really force students to start thinking about slope in both of those ways within one problem. And so that can be multiple representations, that can be asking them specifically to make those connections, whatever the case may be. And so if you're interested, I would be happy to share those with you. But for the sake of not making you late for your next talk, I will politely ask if there are any questions, and if you'd like to hang around, I'd be happy to show those. Gina?
Yeah, question. Do you have any plans to follow up on the students in your study who then went on to take other courses that perhaps required some understanding and knowledge of slope?
I'd like to.
That'd be
Yeah.
great, that'd be really rich if you could do it. But
I
you
know.
You probably need another person to help you, huh?
I could probably get access to that information, but it would just be a final grade. It wouldn't be
Oh, no, you need to look at work, I think.
exactly,
Yeah.
and so I think that would be the
Yeah.
piece that would be difficult.
Unless you contact them and ask them if they'd be willing to come back.
Oh, yeah, do a little follow-up,
Yeah.
post.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were a great group.
That
I'm
would
sure
be
they
great,
probably
yeah.
welcome the chance to get together.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Other questions?
You wanna share anything?
I mean, I'd love to. Don't feel obligated to stay, but if you'd like to see, yeah, sure, I'd be happy to.
I need to go, cause.
That's okay.
So thanks for this.
No
But I
problem.
wanna talk to you more about what you do
Okay,
in the interim.
okay, great.